The pre-dawn gloom over the Tennessee River that day seemed palpable, dense and heavy, as if nature itself held its breath before the inevitable. The water in the gorge, known among local tribes as a place where evil spirits dwelled, didn't just flow, it boiled, swirling into gigantic whirlpools capable, according to legends, of dragging an entire canoe to the bottom. Rocks loomed over the current like dark, silent sentinels, hiding in their crevices shadows more dangerous than any river rapid. It was here, in this natural amphitheater, where the roar of the water drowned out all sounds and visibility was limited to 10 meters, that a drama unfolded, becoming a symbol of an entire era. A group of heavy, flat-bottomed barges, laden with the simple possessions of settlers, livestock, and tools, slowly and painfully made their way upstream. The people on deck did not sleep. Their eyes, reddened from strain and sleepless nights, peered into the thick green of the banks, trying to discern movement where, it seemed, nothing living could exist. Mothers pressed children to their chests, covering their mouths with their palms so that an accidental cry would not betray their presence, although the creak of oarlocks and the splash of oars had long since alerted the forest to their intrusion. They knew they were in territory that cartographers marked with white spots, and rumors imbued with mystical dread. These were the domains of those who refused to retreat. A sudden, piercing cry of a jay tore through the monotonous hum of the river. To an inexperienced ear, it was just a forest sound, but the frontier veterans on the lead raft grew cold. Birds don't cry like that in the pre-dawn hour. Before the echo could fade, the green wall of the forest exploded with fire. Gunpowder flashes in the morning twilight resembled a swarm of enraged fireflies. The whistle of lead bullets mingled with the crack of splinters knocked from the sides of the boats. This was not a chaotic attack by a scattered group. This was a symphony of destruction, orchestrated with terrifying precision. The shooters on the bank didn't just shoot. They drove the flotilla into the most dangerous part of the channel, directly onto sharp underwater rocks, turning the river from a path of salvation into a deadly trap. Thus began another act of a tragedy that spanned 2 decades, a conflict that rewrote the rules of warfare on the American continent and left an indelible scar on the history of the conquest of the West. To understand the nature of this fury and the reasons that forced people to turn into invisible ghosts of war, we need to rewind time to the moment when the very idea of peace was torn to shreds. In the spring of 1776, a great council gathered on the banks of the Watauga River. Cherokee chiefs, weary of endless skirmishes and enticed by colonist goods, prepared to sign a treaty ceding vast territories of present-day Kentucky and Tennessee to land speculators. But amidst the general hum of agreement, a voice rang out that silenced everyone. Dragging Canoe, son of the great chief Attakullakulla, rose from his seat. He was tall, his face bore the marks of smallpox, but his eyes burned with the fire of fanatic conviction. He did not speak of peace. He spoke of how the cession of land was the beginning of the end. He predicted that the white people would not stop until they took everything, and that signing the treaty would turn the rich hunting grounds into a dark and bloody ground. His words fell into the crowd like heavy stones. Refusing to accept the will of the majority, he committed an act unparalleled in the history of his people. He declared a split, the departure of Dragging Canoe and his followers south into the wild and inaccessible areas of Chickamauga Creek marked the birth of a new force. This was no longer just a tribe in the traditional sense, it was a military order, a confederation of irreconcilables where warriors from different clans and even other nations, Creeks, Shawnees, and even runaway loyalists who remained loyal to the British crown, flocked. They left not to hide, but to build a base for a new type of war. The region they chose was ideal for this purpose. The southern foothills of the Appalachians were a natural fortress, a labyrinth of narrow canyons, sheer cliffs, and dense forests, where a European-style army lost all its advantages. Here it was impossible to build a front line. Linear tactics did not work here. Dragging Canoe understood that he could not defeat the Americans in an open field, where numbers and artillery would decide the outcome of the battle in an hour. But here, in the mountains, he could wage a war that would last forever. The strategy developed in these mountains was a century ahead of its time in military thought. The Chickamauga, as these people came to be called after the river on whose banks they settled, transformed geography itself into a weapon of mass destruction. They abandoned static defense. Their towns, 11 settlements stretching along the Tennessee River, were not merely residential areas, but logistical hubs that could be rapidly evacuated. The main principle became total mobility and ubiquity. A Chickamauga warrior was not a soldier marching in formation. He was a hunter for whom man had become the most dangerous prey. They operated in small groups, capable of covering up to 50 miles a day over rugged terrain, appearing where they were least expected and vanishing before the enemy could raise the alarm. This was a war of nerves, calculated to psychologically exhaust the enemy. The tactic of invisible presence turned life in frontier settlements into an unending nightmare. Imagine the psychological state of a farmer going out to plow his field, knowing that any bush at the edge of the forest could conceal the barrel of a rifle. The colonists lived in a state of permanent siege. The concept of safety vanished from their lexicon. People stopped going out alone. Every action, from fetching water to chopping wood, became a military operation with sentries posted and combat security. The architecture of settlements necessarily changed, reflecting this new reality. Houses became bastions, thick log walls, narrow loopholes instead of windows, overhanging second floors, allowing fire directly downwards onto those attempting to set the walls ablaze. Yards were enclosed by 12-foot palisades. But even these measures did not guarantee survival. The Chickamauga knew how to wait. They could lie in ambush for days, motionless, awaiting the moment when a sentry's vigilance wavered or a fort's gate remained open slightly longer than it should. Particularly sophisticated was their tactic of using natural sounds for communication. A bird's whistle, an owl's hoot, a wolf's howl. For the settlers, these were sounds of the night. For the warriors, they were commands to attack or signals of danger. The forest, which for the white man was a chaos of vegetation, was for the Indian an open book and a communication system. They knew how to move so that not a single branch would snap underfoot, how to use stream beds to conceal tracks from bloodhounds, how to camouflage themselves with mud and leaves so effectively that one could pass within 2 steps of the enemy unnoticed. This quote, too, often led American militiamen to shoot at shadows, expending ammunition and their nervous systems, fighting an enemy they couldn't even see. Paranoia became the Chickamauga's main ally. The fear of the unknown was more effective than a bullet. It forced settlers to abandon established homes and flee back eastward, spreading panicked rumors of forest demons that could not be stopped. However, war demanded resources, and this is where the third geopolitical layer of the conflict came into play. Dragging Canoe was not only a great tactician, but also a shrewd diplomat. He understood that bows and arrows could not stand against rifled muskets. He needed gunpowder, lead, and modern weapons, and he found a source of supply where the interests of world powers converged. The Spanish Empire, which at that time owned Louisiana and controlled the mouth of the Mississippi, watched with apprehension the expansion of the young American Republic. For the Spanish governor in New Orleans, Native American resistance was an ideal buffer, stemming the flow of English-speaking colonists. A complex game began. Caravans of boats laden with barrels of gunpowder, muskets, and lead ingots made their way up the great rivers. The gold of the Spanish crown was being turned into bullets in the forests of Tennessee. This logistical support allowed the Chickamauga to wage war at a level inaccessible to other tribes. They had no problems with ammunition, which often became the Achilles heel of Native American uprisings. Moreover, the availability of quality European weapons allowed them to change their long-range tactics. Native American snipers, armed with Spanish muskets and English rifles, became a formidable force. They learned to choose priority targets, primarily taking out officers and guides. Economic warfare also became part of the strategy. Raids were carried out not only for intimidation, but also for plunder. The theft of horses and cattle undermined the economic base of the settlements, depriving farmers of their livelihoods and transport. Thousands of head of cattle were driven south along secret trails, where they were sold to middlemen or used to supply the resistance army. Thus, the war fed itself. But any conflict is a two-sided process of adaptation. American settlers on the frontier were people of a special kind. Those who were weak in spirit had long since perished or fled. Those who were willing to pay for the land with blood remained. The constant pressure from the Chickamauga forged a new type of American soldier, far removed from European standards. Frontier inhabitants, such as John Sevier and James Robertson, understood that the enemy could only be defeated by his own methods. The old tactic of passive defense in forts was deemed a dead end. One cannot win a war by sitting behind walls while the enemy holds the initiative. The transformation of the militia began. They shed their heavy uniforms, donning light hunting shirts the color of fallen leaves, learned to walk in moccasins to make no noise, and adopted skirmishing tactics. An institution of rangers emerged. Special reconnaissance detachments whose task was not to engage in combat, but to observe, track, and deliver pinpoint strikes. These men lived for days in the forest, eating jerky, sleeping on the ground, and learning to read tracks better than the Indians themselves. A counter-game of intelligence began. American spies penetrated deep into enemy territory, mapping secret trails, crossings, and the locations of food caches. The war ceased to be a one-sided game. Now, Chickamauga warriors, returning from a raid, might find their own homes burned and supplies destroyed. The feeling of absolute safety in mountain strongholds began to melt away. This was a psychological turning point. When the hunter begins to feel like prey, his confidence cracks. The key technological factor that shifted the balance of power was the Kentucky, or Pennsylvania, rifle. This long-barreled rifled weapon had a range and accuracy significantly superior to the smoothbore muskets with which many Indians were initially armed. An experienced settler marksman could hit a target the size of a man's head at 200 yards, a distance unthinkable for ordinary military tactics of the time. This advantage allowed militiamen to keep the enemy at a distance, preventing them from closing in for hand-to-hand combat, where the tomahawk and knife gave the Indians an advantage. The technological gap, compounded by the growing number of settlers, began to slowly but surely tighten the noose around Chickamauga. The decisive moment came in the early 90s of the 18th century. By this time, dragging canoe had passed away. not from an enemy bullet, but from exhaustion, having given his all to this endless war. His successors continued the struggle, but the strategic situation had changed. The trickle of settlers had turned into a tsunami. Cities grew where isolated farms once stood, and roads were laid. The federal government finally turned serious attention to the problem of the Southwest. But the final blow was delivered not by the regular army, but by militia forces, who decided to put an end to the threat once and for all. The expedition to Nickajack in September 1794 was a masterpiece of special operations of its time. Major James Orr, who led this campaign, gambled on what seemed impossible: the covert passage of a huge detachment through the most impassable mountains. More than 500 men moved in complete silence, without supply trains, carrying everything they needed themselves. They marched at night, avoiding hill crests so their silhouettes would not be visible against the sky. A guide from among former captives, familiar with the terrain, led them along paths unknown to Chickamauga patrols. It was a march at the limit of human capabilities, but hatred and the desire to secure their families drove the men forward better than any order. It was deep night when the detachment reached the Tennessee River opposite Nickajack. The town slept, confident in its inaccessibility. The wide river and high mountains seemed a reliable defense. But the Americans had prepared a surprise. Instead of searching for a ford, they built rafts from logs and hides into which they placed weapons and gunpowder to keep them dry, while they themselves swam alongside, pushing the rafts in the icy water. This crossing became legendary. Hundreds of people crossed the turbulent river in complete darkness without uttering a sound. When the first rays of the sun touched the treetops, hell broke loose on the streets of Nickajack. The surprise was absolute. Warriors, accustomed to being masters of the situation, awoke to the whistle of bullets in their own homes. Panic and chaos engulfed the settlement. Organized resistance was impossible. Those who tried to grab weapons fell under the crossfire of marksmen who had already taken advantageous positions. Women and children frantically sought cover. The battle turned into a rout. Nickajack was followed by the destruction of the neighboring settlement of Running Water. In one day, the myth of the impregnability of the 5 lower towns, cultivated for decades, was shattered. Smoke from burning huts was visible for many miles around, serving as a terrible signal for all other tribes. There was no longer any refuge. The loss of Nickajack was a catastrophe not so much military as economic and moral. Along with the homes, winter food supplies burned. Warehouses with Spanish gunpowder were destroyed. The resistance network was torn apart. But most importantly, the spirit was broken. The chiefs realized that further resistance would lead not to victory, but to the complete physical annihilation of their people. The Spanish, seeing that their hand was played out and preoccupied with their problems in Europe, sharply reduced aid. The Chickamauga were left alone against a furious and vastly superior enemy. The agonizing process of coming to terms with the new reality began. Soon after these events, negotiations began, leading to the signing of peace at Tellico Blockhouse. The war, which had lasted 18 years, ended. However, the history of the Chickamauga Wars is not just a chronicle of military actions. It is a deep philosophical conflict between two civilizations, two ways of perceiving the world. For the European, land was a commodity, a resource that could be measured, fenced, and sold. Land ownership was the basis of freedom and status. For the Indian, land was a sacred mother, given by ancestors to be preserved. The idea of selling land was as absurd to them as the idea of selling air or sunlight. this ideological rift could not be overcome by treaties. It could only be resolved by force. The paradox was that in the course of this brutal struggle, opponents adopted traits from each other. The Americans became increasingly savage, adopting guerrilla tactics, clothing, and even elements of their enemies' thinking. The Indians, in turn, mastered market economics, diplomacy, and modern technology. A terrible diffusion of cultures occurred through the rifle scope. The lessons we can draw from this history today are strikingly relevant. The Chickamauga Wars showed that technological superiority does not guarantee a quick victory if the enemy is highly motivated and skillfully uses the terrain. They demonstrated the power of asymmetric warfare, where a small group can paralyze a vast system with fear and uncertainty. But they also showed that resource base and adaptability ultimately outweigh tactical genius. The American colonization machine was relentless precisely in its ability to absorb blows, recover, and keep moving forward. Today, standing on the shore of Nickajack Lake, it's hard to believe that beneath the calm waters lie the ruins of ancient cities and the bones of warriors who tried to stop the course of history. Modern civilization has hidden the scars of that war under the concrete of dams and the asphalt of highways. But the spirit of those events has not disappeared. It is dissolved in the mists of the Appalachians, in the names of rivers and mountains. The story of dragging canoes' struggle reminds us that the price paid for the creation of modern America was monstrously high. This is not just a beautiful frontier legend. It is a tale of collision, pain, courage, and the tragedy of losing an entire world. And although the cannons have long been silent, the echo of those shots still rings for those who are willing to listen, reminding us of the fragility of cultures and that there are often no winners in such wars, only survivors, forever changed by the experience. This historical experience shaped the unique character of the residents of the Southern Appalachians. Independent, stubborn, distrustful of external authority, and relying only on themselves and their families. The mentality born in besieged forts and on forest trails lives on to this day. Thus, the Chickamauga Wars did not end in 1794. They melted into the cultural code of the region, becoming an integral part of American identity. And in this, perhaps, lies Dragging Canoe's main victory. His people did not disappear without a trace. They became part of the very fabric of the nation that tried to conquer them, changing it from within forever.